Hey there, welcome back to True Asian Nightmare. It's just Kay. If the world felt a little too loud today, or if you're struggling to switch off your mind, you're in the right place. You don't have to carry that burden into the night. Take a slow breath, soften your posture, and let's replace that mental noise with some real horror stories. Leaving a gentle like and subscribing to the channel is a great way to show support, and of course it ensures there will always be another nightmare waiting for you every other night. There's a really calm community building in the comments, so feel free to drop the name of your city and the time you're listening. Sharing this midnight space together, no matter how far apart we are, makes the dark feel much less lonely. All right, go ahead and pull the covers up, dim the screen, and let's get lost in these true paranormal stories. I gotta be honest right off the bat. My name is Quinn, and I was a complete garbage husband to my wife, Tessa. We got married young, but when we found out she couldn't have kids, the house just got so damn quiet that I started taking off for weeks, sometimes months, just drinking and messing around with my buddies. People in the neighborhood kept telling me to find a second wife to give me a son, and telling her to dump my sorry ass. But we just stayed stuck in this miserable, sexless marriage for over 10 years. You have to understand the kind of pressure that builds up in a small community like ours when a couple cannot produce a child. Every single time I walked down the street to grab a pack of cigarettes, I could feel the eyes of the older women boring into the back of my head, whispering about how my family line was going to die out. They would corner Tessa at the morning market and tell her to her face that she should just adopt an orphan from the temple, or better yet, just leave me entirely and live alone. They told her she would be much happier being single than waiting up for a husband who was never home. And they were probably right, because I was constantly running away from the reality of our life. I never cheated on her, but that is literally the only good thing you could say about me during that time. I just became obsessed with finding any excuse to not be inside that stifling, quiet house. I would spend all day sitting on cheap plastic stools at the corner cafe, drinking iced coffee, and playing Chinese chess with the neighborhood guys for hours on end, gambling away $5 or $10 a game just to kill time. I went on fishing trips with my buddies that lasted for entire weeks. I would go out drinking and not come back until the sun came up, and Tessa just stayed home, sweeping the same tile floors, cooking meals I never ate, and rotting away in complete isolation. By the time we were pushing 40, it had been at least 3 or 4 years since I had even touched her in bed. I literally told her once that there was no point in sleeping together anymore since nothing was ever going to come of it anyway. It was an incredibly screwed up thing to say, but I was just so numb to everything back then. Things finally reached a breaking point after I came back from a massive 2-month trip with my friends. I had only been sleeping at home for about a week before the walls started feeling like they were closing in on me again. The silence in the house was just suffocating. So, I dragged my canvas duffel bag out of the closet and started packing my clothes again. I casually told Tessa that I was heading out for another month to clear my head. She absolutely snapped. She did not yell or throw things like a normal person would. Instead, she walked out of the kitchen holding this dirty white plastic bottle of agricultural pesticide, the kind they use on the farms outside of town that smells like burning sulfur and chemicals. She gripped that bottle so hard her knuckles turned entirely white, and she looked me dead in the eye with this terrifying calmness. She told me that if I took even half a step outside the front door, she was going to uncap that bottle and drink the entire thing right in front of me. She said she was completely exhausted from being treated like a piece of unwanted furniture for over a decade. She told me to just abandon her permanently and go find some other woman to pop out 5 or 7 kids for me, because she could not handle the torture of me coming and going whenever I pleased anymore. She warned me that if I walked out that door today, she was ending her own life. I looked at her standing there, shaking with that cheap bottle of poison, and I thought it was complete crap. I honestly thought she was just putting on a dramatic show to manipulate me into staying home. She had always been so passive and quiet, so I figured there was absolutely no way she actually had the guts to go through with it. But I was also just a little bit curious. I wanted to call her bluff. So I told her I was leaving anyway, grabbed my duffel bag, and walked loudly out the front door. But the second I stepped outside, I completely silenced my footsteps. I ducked down below the window frames, crept around the side of the concrete wall, and slipped into our backyard. We had this thick cluster of overgrown banana trees back there, and a faded fabric hammock tied between two wooden posts that was completely hidden from the house. I laid down on the hammock, making sure I had a clear view of the back door through the giant green leaves. I could hear her through the thin walls of the house. She was pacing back and forth on the tile floor, sobbing uncontrollably. I watched through the window slats as she repeatedly uncapped the pesticide, brought the rim all the way to her trembling lips, and then jerked it away while crying harder. She kept doing this over and over, just completely paralyzed by fear. I actually smirked to myself while lying on the hammock, thinking about how I was right all along, and she was never going to do it. I figured I had already missed my afternoon bus anyway, so I decided to just close my eyes and take a nap in the humid afternoon heat, planning to sneak back inside later and act like nothing happened. I don't know exactly what time it was, maybe around 2:15 p.m. or something close to that, but I was abruptly pulled out of a deep sleep. The backyard was usually dead silent in the middle of the afternoon until I heard this incredibly fast, heavy thudding sound of bare feet sprinting against the packed dirt path right next to the banana trees, just going thud, 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 thud. In a total blind panic, I ripped my eyes open, completely annoyed, and saw Tessa standing right beside my hammock. She looked absolutely horrific. Her face was completely drained of color, almost like a grayish white, and her eyes were blown wide open in pure terror. She was shivering violently, and when she opened her mouth, her voice came out in this frantic, stuttering mess. She frantically begged me to get up and run into the main house right that second, because she was suddenly convulsing on the floor. She kept repeating my name, crying that she was so incredibly angry at me that she actually swallowed the poison, but now her chest was on fire and she couldn't breathe. She pleaded with me to hurry up and go inside to check on her body before it was too late. I stared at her like she had completely lost her mind. I told her she was speaking absolute nonsense because she was physically standing right in front of my face, so there was no logical way she could be convulsing on the floor inside the house. She completely ignored what I said and just kept pleading. She started kicking the edge of my hammock to physically shake me awake, stuttering over her words, begging me to run inside because she was running out of time. I got so incredibly pissed off at her nagging that I sat up and swung my right arm out to shove her away from the hammock. I yelled at her to go back inside and let me sleep, telling her that if she actually had the guts to drink that poison, I would chop my own head off. But my hand never made contact with her shoulder. My arm swept entirely through the empty air where her chest should have been. The exact second my fingers passed through her, she just vanished. She did not fade away or run off. She simply ceased to exist right in front of my open eyes. My stomach completely dropped into my shoes. A cold sweat instantly broke out all over the back of my neck. I scrambled out of the hammock, tripping over my own feet in the dirt, and sprinted toward the back door of the house. I ripped the door open and bolted into the living room. Tessa was lying on the cold tile floor. Her face was entirely purple. Her eyes were rolled so far back into her skull that I could only see the red veins in the whites of her eyes, and thick, bubbly foam was pouring out of the corners of her mouth. Her entire body was jerking and twitching in a violent seizure. The plastic bottle of pesticide was lying empty next to her twitching hand. She was completely gone. I mean, flatlined. Like, no pulse, nothing. I found out later that her heart had actually stopped beating for a couple of minutes right around the exact same time she was standing in the backyard talking to me. I started screaming at the top of my lungs. The neighbors heard the commotion and came rushing in. We threw her onto a handcart and sprinted all the way to the local clinic. It was an absolute miracle that she survived, mostly because the pesticide she bought was a cheap, watered-down brand that only cost maybe $15 at the hardware store. The doctors pumped her stomach, flushed the toxins out of her system, and managed to bring her back from the absolute brink. She came home a few days later, incredibly weak and barely able to speak. I was so deeply traumatized by the sight of her soul leaving her body to beg for help that I completely unpacked my bags. I stayed home for an entire solid month. I did not dare leave the neighborhood. The only place I went was the local coffee shop down the street, and I would always come straight back. I actually thought the worst was over, but I was so completely wrong. When Tessa came back from the hospital, she brought something back with her. The older folks in the neighborhood started saying she had developed a spiritual mouth. It started with small, unexplainable things. One morning, I was grabbing my keys to take my motorbike down to the cafe. Tessa suddenly reached out and clamped her hand around my wrist. She stared at the wall and told me in a very flat voice that I needed to wait exactly 5 minutes before leaving the house. She said that if I left right now, my front tire was going to explode, and I would be forced to push the heavy bike all the way back home. I rolled my eyes, ripped my arm away from her grip, and told her to stop being so weird. I kicked the engine over and drove off. I didn't even make it to the main intersection before I heard a deafening pop. I had run over a rusted industrial nail the size of my thumb. The tire was completely shredded, and I had to push that heavy bike for nearly 2 miles in the blistering heat, realizing with a sick feeling in my gut that she was exactly right. Then came the raincoat incident. It was a scorching hot afternoon. There was not a single dark cloud in the sky, and the sun was just beating down on the pavement. I was heading out the door when Tessa walked out of the bedroom and tossed a thick plastic raincoat right at my chest. She told me to put it on immediately because I was going to get caught in a massive downpour. I looked at the blazing sun, threw the raincoat onto the living room chair, and told her she was losing her mind. I drove away, and exactly 10 minutes down the road, the sky instantly turned pitch black. A freak thunderstorm rolled in out of nowhere and dumped absolute buckets of water on me. I had to pull over under a tin roof, shivering and completely soaked to the bone. Her predictions started getting more specific and way more unnerving. There was a pregnant woman living 2 doors down from us. This woman had gone to the city hospital for multiple advanced ultrasounds, and the doctors had confirmed to her family with 100% certainty that she was having a baby girl. The family was thrilled. But one afternoon, Tessa walked past the pregnant woman, stopped dead in her tracks, and just stared blankly at her swollen belly. She calmly told the woman that the ultrasound machines were completely wrong, and that she was definitely carrying a boy that looked exactly like the father. The pregnant woman got incredibly offended, and her family actually came over to yell at us for saying crazy things. But a few months later, after Tessa was already gone, that woman gave birth to a perfectly healthy baby boy. But the moment the absolute primal terror really set in for me was the incident with the local gangster. We were sitting in the kitchen eating lunch one afternoon. Tessa was chewing on some rice, completely normal. Suddenly, her entire body just froze. Her spoon stopped halfway to her mouth, and her eyes locked onto the open front door. There was a local gang member walking past our front gate. He was a violent guy covered in cheap tattoos, who was always causing serious trouble in the neighborhood, and he was just strolling by, talking casually on his cell phone. Tessa narrowed her eyes and stared at him without blinking a single time. It was this dead, predatory stare that made all the hair on my arms stand straight up. Suddenly, she dropped her rice bowl on the table, sprinted out the front door, grabbed this hardened criminal by his shirt collar, and forcefully dragged him into our living room. The guy was absolutely furious. He shouted at her to let go of him, asking what her freaking problem was because he had to go meet his brothers at the local bar. But Tessa just slammed the front door shut, locked the heavy metal deadbolt, and planted her feet firmly in front of the exit. She looked up at this massive thug and told him in a completely emotionless voice that if he stepped outside that door, he was going to get hacked to pieces by the rival group waiting for him, and he would absolutely die today. I jumped out of my chair and tried to intervene, begging her to let the guy go before he beat the crap out of both of us. But she possessed this unnatural, terrifying strength. She physically pinned him inside our house for 20 straight minutes, completely ignoring his violent threats and his cursing. Eventually, the guy got so pissed off that he ran to the back of our house, vaulted over our concrete fence, and escaped down the alleyway. Tessa just sighed. Her shoulders slumped, and she quietly told me that the danger had passed. Exactly 30 minutes later, someone pounded frantically on our front door. I opened it, and that exact same gangster collapsed onto his knees on my front porch. He was sobbing hysterically, shaking from head to toe, and he actually tried to bow down to my wife. He was hyperventilating, thanking her over and over again, saying that if she had not delayed him, he would be a dead man. He told us that his entire crew had been ambushed at the bar by a rival gang with machetes right around the exact time he was supposed to arrive. He said all of his brothers were currently bleeding out in the emergency hospital, and he was the only one who avoided the massacre. After that day, the entire neighborhood treated Tessa like some kind of living deity. People were constantly lining up outside our gate, begging her for lottery numbers, asking for health predictions, and bringing her gifts. But Tessa kept the gate locked and turned every single one of them away. The neighbors started getting angry, calling her incredibly selfish, reminding her how they used to comfort her when I abandoned her for months. But Tessa just looked at them with these exhausted, hollow eyes and finally explained the horrifying truth. She told them she did not have any magical powers. She said if she looked at the lines on someone's palm, they just looked like a bunch of squiggly little mosquito larvae to her. She didn't know jack shit about any of it. She explained that ever since she died on that living room floor, there was an invisible old man standing right behind her left shoulder, and whenever something terrible was about to happen, the old man would lean forward and whisper the exact details directly into her ear. She said she was simply repeating his words out loud. She said the voice was cold and raspy, and it would just whisper things like, "They are waiting to butcher him in the street. Lock the door." She told everyone she had absolutely no control over it, and that looking at people's faces now just gave her overwhelming anxiety. This terrifying routine went on for about 2 months. Then, exactly 1 week before she died, her entire personality completely fractured. The quiet version of her, the one who just swallowed all my crap for a decade, she just vanished overnight. She became incredibly aggressive and dominant in the house. One morning, I got slightly annoyed about something trivial, and I raised my voice at her. Before I could even blink, she stepped forward and slapped me directly across the face, so fucking hard that I literally saw bright flashes of light in my vision. I was absolutely stunned. I just stood there holding my burning cheek, completely speechless. She pointed a finger right between my eyes and told me that she was only going to be around to take care of me for maybe another week or 10 days, at the absolute maximum, because the people from the other side were coming to take her away. She demanded to know how I was going to survive alone in this house, without her cooking and cleaning, speaking to me like I was a helpless child. I asked her where the hell she thought she was going, considering she had not traveled outside our town in over 10 years. She just gave me this grim, dark look and told me that I didn't need to know the details, but I had better start learning how to wash my own clothes. For that entire final week, I was completely terrified of her. I became entirely submissive. Every time my friends came to the front gate to ask if I wanted to go play chess or grab a coffee, Tessa would grip my forearm with fingers that felt like cold iron clamps. She would stare down my friends and tell them I wasn't going anywhere, and then she would turn to me and say I needed to stay inside because our time was almost up. I actually had to stand at the gate and tell my buddies I couldn't come out because my wife forbade it. They laughed in my face, but I didn't care. I felt this horrible, suffocating dread sitting right in the center of my chest, and my instincts were screaming at me that something catastrophic was approaching. Then came the final day. It was a Tuesday, I think. Actually, no, it was a Thursday, because I remember the specific sound of the neighborhood broadcast playing outside. All of her anger and dominance just vanished overnight. She woke up smiling. She started talking to me like we were 20 years old again, calling me sweet names, reminiscing about the local fair where we first met, and talking about how we used to share cheap mooncakes by the river when we were dating. It was so completely out of character and unsettling, but I just went along with it because it felt incredibly nice to see her happy. We actually laid in bed together that afternoon. We finally slept together for the first time in over 10 years, and I mean we actually had sex. It felt like all the bitterness, the resentment, and the years of toxic silence had completely washed away in that 1 hour. But as soon as we finished, the atmosphere in the bedroom instantly shifted. The air got freezing cold, and Tessa rolled over onto her back and just started crying silently. Thick tears were rolling down her temples and soaking into the pillow. I felt this massive, crushing wave of guilt wash over me. I pulled her close and told her I was so incredibly sorry for being such a garbage husband all these years. I promised her that we were going to start over right now. I told her I didn't care if we never had a child, and that we were just going to live for each other from now on. She didn't hug me back. She just stared blankly up at the ceiling and told me it was too late because she had to leave with them tomorrow. She said she had seen way too much. She told me she had learned things about the mechanics of the other side that the living were never ever supposed to know. And because she had opened her mouth and constantly interfered with the natural fates of the people in our town, the entities were finally coming to collect her to balance the scales. She apologized for drinking that pesticide, crying that if she hadn't been so reckless and impulsive that day, we could have actually had a beautiful, normal life together. She told me our story was ending right here, in this lifetime, and that maybe we would find each other in the next one. I tried to brush it off, trying to suppress the panic rising in my throat. I told her the doctors had completely flushed the poison out of her system months ago, that she was just feeling fatigued, and she would be perfectly fine after a good night's sleep. She completely ignored me. She calmly sat up and started listing out strict instructions for her own funeral. She told me she was going to wear her favorite silk outfit to sleep tonight, and she explicitly forbade me from letting the morticians undress her or change her clothes when they prepared her body. She told me exactly how to arrange the altar in the living room. She even gave me her blessing to remarry after she was gone, promising she wouldn't hold any spiritual grudges against my new wife. By nightfall, my nerves were completely destroyed. I was sweating through my shirt, jumping at every single shadow that moved across the bedroom wall. She put on the exact clothes she wanted to be buried in, lay down on the mattress, crossed her hands neatly over her stomach, and closed her eyes with a faint smile on her face. I pulled up a stiff wooden chair right next to the bed. I absolutely refused to sleep. I was going to sit there all night and physically fight off whatever the hell she thought was coming to take her. I drank 3 cups of black coffee, just sitting there in the suffocating silence, watching her chest slowly rise and fall with every breath. Every single hour felt like a torturous lifetime. The only sounds were the slow ticking of the wall clock and the distant howling of stray dogs in the alleyway. I was physically staring right at her the entire night, watching her breathe, absolutely terrified of whatever she said was coming for her. But she just laid there with this weird frozen smile, and by the time the sun came up, her body was already completely stiff and cold as ice. Whatever took her didn't even have to physically enter the room. They just reached right inside her, pulled her soul out while looking me dead in the eye, and I was too stupid to even notice. When I finally realized she wasn't breathing, I completely lost my mind. I bolted out the front door and ran out into the alleyway, just screaming my lungs out, begging for someone to come help me. But none of the neighbors even believed me at first. They had just seen us acting like a happy couple the day before, so they thought I was just drunk or going crazy. I was literally dragging myself on the dirt, crawling on my hands and knees and sobbing, practically pulling people back to my house. But by the time anyone actually stepped inside, she was already gone. That's why I'm here now. I shaved my head right after the funeral. I moved out of that house and basically live at the local temple as a lay Buddhist. I spend my days sweeping the courtyard, making offerings, and just drowning in this absolute, suffocating regret. If I had just stopped her from drinking that pesticide, none of this would have happened. You know, getting married at 19 to a 17-year-old is crazy enough. But doing it when you are a soft city boy from Saigon and your wife is from the absolute hardcore boonies of Vin Long? Yeah, that was a whole different level of stupid on my part. This was about 14 or 15 years ago, way back when texting and early social media were just barely becoming a thing. We had been talking online, met up when I took a trip down to her province with some buddies, and after dating for just over a year, we decided to tie the knot. Right after our normal city wedding, my wife Lorna actually stayed at my family's house in Saigon for about 3 or 4 days to do the whole traditional daughter-in-law introduction thing before we had to travel back down to her hometown. That was when I got hit with this extremely rural tradition where I had to go back to her village for a full week to be a live-in son-in-law. I guess I need to ramble a bit to paint a picture of what this place actually looked like, because if you have never been deep in the Mekong Delta, you really have no idea how isolating it gets. We are talking about a place with 0 streetlights, just endless stretches of muddy rice paddies, narrow dirt roads, and this suffocating humidity that makes your clothes stick to your skin 24/7. The whole point of this trip was for her tough-as-nails uncles to haze the absolute crap out of me. They were very blunt about the logic behind it. They sat me down and told me that since their precious niece was going up to the big city to be my wife, basically serving my family for the rest of her life, I owed them at least 5 to 7 days of absolute servitude down there as payback. It was their way of getting preemptive revenge. They wanted to haze me and intimidate me so badly that if things ever went sour between us, if the marriage got rocky, I would be too terrified to ever mistreat or abandon her. I had to prove my worth through blood, sweat, and a ridiculous amount of alcohol. So for the first 3 or 4 days, I was just trying to survive the physical hazing. I was this pale city kid who had never done a day of hard labor in his life, and these uncles made it their personal mission to break me. I tried to be a good sport about it. They made me climb these massive, towering coconut trees barefoot. I kept slipping down the rough bark, literally tearing the skin off both of my palms until they were raw and bleeding, but I just smiled and kept going. I actually joked with them, saying I wanted the real Delta experience because a city boy like me never gets the chance to swim in the rivers or climb trees. They had me paddling those tiny, unstable wooden boats through murky canals, setting up woven bamboo traps to catch fish, hauling in heavy mud-soaked nets, and scrubbing down the ancestral altars out in the blistering sun. Lorna would constantly try to step in and beg her aunts and uncles to stop pushing me so hard, but they just called her crazy and told her to shut up because they needed to put the fear of God into me. Even my parents-in-law, who honestly really loved me, had to stay completely quiet because they were lower on the extended family hierarchy and simply could not talk back to the older uncles. I just pulled Lorna aside and told her not to worry. I really loved her, and I wanted to prove to her family that I was tough enough to take care of her. During those first few days, the drinking was relatively light. I am not a heavy drinker anyway. Maybe I can handle 7 or 8 cans of beer or a small bottle of liquor before I am totally done. We would sit around the table in the front yard at night, knock back a few drinks until maybe 7 p.m. or 8 p.m., and then they would let me go inside to sleep because I was physically exhausted. But by the 4th or maybe the 5th day, things shifted. I think they realized the physical labor was not breaking my spirit, so they decided to switch to psychological warfare and heavy liquor. Their new goal was to force me to drink until I either threw up on my own shoes or passed out face first in the dirt. They sat me down at the table around sundown and brought out these massive plastic jugs of homemade rice wine. This stuff is practically rubbing alcohol, probably cost them maybe 30,000 dong, which is barely over $1, but it burns your throat and makes your eyes water just smelling it. Before we even poured the first glass, the oldest uncle pointed a thick finger at Lorna, who was standing near the door, and he flat out banned her from coming outside. He told her that this was strictly between the men, and if she tried to step in and carry her husband inside, they would completely disown me as a nephew. I could see how worried she was, hovering in the shadows, but I just gave her a nod and told her to go to sleep. I patted my chest and assured her I could handle it. I figured I could survive a few hours of drinking. I was so incredibly wrong. By the time 9 p.m. rolled around, I was struggling to keep my head up. The uncles were relentless. Every time I emptied my glass, they filled it right back up. Then, they brought up the grandfather. They started telling me how strict the old man used to be. They swore that if he was still alive, he would never have let me stay for just 7 days. He would have made me live there and work like a dog for a full month, or maybe a whole year, or even 3 full years, before he ever let me marry his granddaughter. Then they gave me a test. They poured 2 full glasses of that burning rice wine, slid them across the table, and told me that if I really wanted to show respect to the family, I had to walk to the back of the property, all the way to the tomb in the pitch black, and offer a drink to the grandfather. Now, the really creepy thing about this layout was that this specific concrete tomb was the only grave located right behind the main house. Every single other family member was buried way out in the distant rice fields, but he was resting just a few dozen yards from the back door. I found out later that this whole grave visit was actually a secret test. They wanted to see if the city boy was scared of ghosts, and more importantly, they wanted to watch my posture as I walked to see if I could hold a straight line so they could gauge exactly how drunk I was. I was dizzy, my vision was swimming, but I just wanted to get it over with so I could finally go to bed. I took the 2 glasses and stumbled away from the safety of the lit front yard, stepping onto that dark dirt path. I am a pretty strict materialist. I do not really believe in ghosts or spirits. I always try to find a logical, scientific explanation for things, but it was so incredibly dark back there. The only light was this weak, pale moonlight filtering through the banana leaves. The air felt thick, heavy with the smell of damp earth and pig manure. I carefully made my way past the rundown pig pen, keeping my eyes on the white concrete of the tomb. When I finally reached the grave, I noticed a shadow standing there. It was maybe a few feet away from the concrete, just this dark silhouette of a person standing perfectly still in the gloom, with one hand resting heavily on the tombstone and the other on its hip in this posture of absolute authority. My drunk brain instantly tried to rationalize it. I figured it was just some neighbor walking the property line to check on the rice fields, maybe hoping to catch some frogs or something. I mean, it was rural Vietnam. People walk around at night. I stepped up, slurred out a respectful greeting, introducing myself as Donovan, poured 1 glass over the cement, and forced myself to swallow the second glass. Right as I wiped my mouth, I heard the shadow make this sharp, clicking sound of a tongue hitting the roof of a mouth in sheer disappointment, and then a raspy old voice muttered into the humid air. "It is a damn shame how they are treating this kid. Absolute nonsense, hazing the poor boy like this." I honestly thought this random neighbor was taking pity on me because he saw the uncles forcing me to drink. I slurred out a quick thank you to the guy and turned around to walk back to the house, but the silence behind me was immediately broken by this heavy, deliberate dragging noise just shuffling against the dry dirt and dead leaves like someone with bad joints trying to keep up with my pace, and my heart started hammering against my ribs because I was out in the middle of nowhere. I glanced over my shoulder and saw that exact same shadow following me. It was walking with this awkward, bow-legged gait, keeping a distance of about 30 feet, its hands now clasped behind its back, just like the old village men do when they stroll around. It just kept constantly muttering under its breath about how cruel my uncles were being. I made it back to the lights of the front yard, breathing heavy, and sat down at the table. I looked back down the path, and the shadow had stopped right by the pig pen, just standing there, shaking its head. I told my uncles that a neighbor was standing by the pigs, and suggested we invite him up for a drink since he seemed concerned. The uncles just stopped and stared at me. They laughed and asked if I was talking about neighbor Bill from next door, but then they squinted into the dark and cursed at me, telling me I was so blind drunk I was seeing things because there was absolutely nobody standing down there. I desperately tried to argue, physically pointing at the shadow that was actively shaking its head at us in the distance, but the oldest uncle just rolled his eyes. He clearly thought I was speaking absolute nonsense, probably assuming I was just making up some pathetic, drunken excuse about seeing things just so I could sneak off to bed early. He was not about to let my weak city boy tolerance ruin their night. So, to punish me for trying to back out, he slammed his thick hand on the table and brought up their strict rural drinking laws. He aggressively reminded me that if you arrive late, you drink 3 penalty glasses, and if you want to leave the table early, you have to down 7. He gave me this mocking smirk and said that out of the kindness of his heart, he would only force me to drink 3 before I could finally go to sleep. I was at my absolute limit. I took the first glass, brought it to my lips, and tried to swallow, but my throat just completely closed up. It was this intense physical blockage, like something was physically wedged in my windpipe. I sat there grimacing, and they were literally tilting the glass up, practically trying to squeeze my throat to force the alcohol down so I would throw up. I started gagging, the alcohol burning the back of my mouth. Right at that exact second, the temperature surrounding my chair dropped like a stone. I felt this freezing cold sensation press flat against the center of my back, almost like someone was standing directly behind me and violently shoving me forward. I let out this weird, choked gasp, and then everything just went entirely black. The next thing I knew, it was the next morning. Lorna was wiping my face with a damp towel, and I felt like I had been hit by a freight train. I stumbled out to the yard to apologize to the uncles for passing out, terrified that I had offended them, but they looked at me with pure disgust. The oldest uncle told me that right after I took that drink, I had violently slapped the glass out of his hand, spat the liquor right out of my mouth in a wide spray, and sat there with my eyes rolled back into my skull, slurring at them to back the hell off and warning them that they had gone far enough. I was horrified. I have zero memory of doing that. I am a calm guy. I do not get aggressive when I drink. I apologized endlessly, swearing I would make it up to them that night by serving them properly. So, night 2 of the heavy drinking begins. Lorna cooked a massive spread to try and smooth things over: grilled snakehead fish, stir-fried intestines, and fried climbing perch with fish sauce. By 6 p.m., we were back at the table, and they were already forcing me to drink 3 penalty glasses just to apologize for my disrespect the night before. Around 7 p.m., they ordered me to go back down to the grave. They used the excuse that since we were leaving for Saigon the very next morning, and I probably would not be back until the annual death anniversaries, I owed the grandfather more respect. I grabbed the glasses and walked down that pitch-black path. My chest was tight. Every step felt heavier than the last. When I reached the pig pen, the shadow was already there waiting. It was standing with its hands on its hips, staring at me from the dark, just exhaling heavily like it was deeply annoyed. I did the routine, poured the drink, and walked back up. We drank for another couple of hours. By 9 p.m. or maybe 10 p.m., they told me to go down again, claiming it had been too long since my last offering. I stumbled back down the path, completely confused as to who this guy was that kept hanging around the property. But this time the shadow was not just standing calmly. It was pacing back and forth. Its limbs bending and contorting had weird, unnatural angles, like it was absolutely furious. And I could hear this wet, ragged breathing slicing through the sound of the crickets. I walked up to the grave, my hands shaking so badly the liquor was spilling over the sides of the glasses. I tried to play it cool. I looked at the shadow and politely introduced myself as the new son-in-law of Madame Tessa, asking if he wanted to come up and join us for food. The figure stopped pacing. It slowly turned toward me, and that raspy voice practically hissed through the darkness, vibrating right inside my eardrums. They think they can sit on the same level as me. I would have snapped their fucking necks for what they are doing. Nobody asked them to invite me. They are just using my grave as an excuse to torture you. I could not breathe. The sheer hatred in that voice froze me right to the bone. My drunk brain frantically tried to rationalize how this random guy could talk down to my older uncles, but I remembered that in rural village hierarchies, a 40-year-old guy can easily outrank a 70-year-old man based on their family tree. I mechanically poured the drink, and right as I did, the shadow spat out another complaint. He grumbled that lighting incense at the family altar was more than enough for respect, and questioned what kind of idiots ask someone to offer wine out in the pitch dark. I choked my drink down and practically ran back up the dirt path. The heavy, dragging footsteps followed right on my heels the entire way, louder and more aggressive than the night before. I collapsed into my plastic chair at the table. The uncles immediately shoved another glass of rice wine in my face, laughing, telling me to chug it. I picked it up with both hands, brought it to my mouth, and tilted my head back. But again, the liquid hit a solid wall in my throat. I could not swallow. The air around me turned to absolute ice. My vision started to blur, not from the alcohol, but from this overwhelming, crushing pressure inside my own skulls. I felt my own muscles violently tense up against my will, my fingers locking around the glass so tightly it almost shattered. I could feel my own consciousness being shoved into the backseat of my own brain, drowning in this freezing, suffocating wave of pure anger that did not belong to me, and then the lights went out for good. When I finally opened my eyes again, it was 7 or 8 a.m., and the morning sun was blinding. I was lying in bed, and my entire body was screaming in agony. My knuckles were split open, my nose was swollen and crusted with dried blood, and my arms were covered in dark purple bruises. Both my mother-in-law and my father-in-law were sitting next to the bed, anxiously rubbing my arms and legs. I panicked, asking Lorna what happened, why I looked like I had been in a street fight. She told me I had single-handedly fought all 3 of her uncles at the same time. She said it was an absolute chaotic brawl, 4 drunk guys throwing punches in the dark, which explained why I took a few hits to the face. I could not believe it. I do not know how to fight. I have never thrown a punch in my life. But my mother-in-law leaned in, her face pale, and asked me exactly what I saw down by the grave. I stuttered through the story, describing the shadow, the dragging footsteps, the raspy voice complaining about the hazing. My mother-in-law just let out a shaky breath, clapped her hands together, and nodded. She told me that when the fight broke out the night before, she had rushed outside to pull me away. But when she grabbed my arm, I had forcefully shoved her back, glared at her with eyes that did not look like mine, and hissed directly into her ear, asking what kind of pathetic mother-in-law just stands there and lets her son-in-law get treated like a dog. And the fighting style? I had not just brawled. I had used hyper-specific, brutal joint locks and neck strikes. She explained that the grandfather used to be a soldier, a real hardcore gangster type like a local Robin Hood who robbed the rich to help the poor, and he absolutely despised anyone who used their power to bully the weak. Later that afternoon, when my mother-in-law went to the local clinic to check on her brothers, they were furiously cursing me out, screaming that I should never be allowed to call them uncle again, because no disrespectful nephew beats his elders to the point of giving them dislocated shoulders, torn skin, and brutally sprained joints. But then she sat them down and told them that it was not me. She reminded them of the specific combat techniques I used, telling them it was their own late father who beat them using his signature old-school combat moves. Man, you should have seen how fast they shut up. They recognized the techniques immediately, realizing their dad had come back to teach them a lesson. It has been about 15 years since that week. Nowadays, the drive from Saigon to Vinh Long takes maybe 3 hours on the new highway, and to this day, whenever we go back to visit for death anniversaries, I will have maybe 1 or 2 beers before those uncles literally push me out of the room to go sleep. They never force me to drink. They always mutter something about not wanting to piss off Grandpa again. Lorna is actually really proud of how much respect I command in her hometown now. And honestly, I guess getting possessed once was the best thing that ever happened to my standing in that family. This whole thing happened over a decade ago, but honestly, it still messes with my head. It's a pretty screwed up cautionary tale about school bullying, involving me, this wildly rebellious kid named Nina, and a new girl, Diana. We were just starting 7th grade, and on the very first day, Diana walked in. She was this big, completely normal-looking kid, talking and smiling like anyone else. But the weirdest part was her mom literally pulled up a chair and sat right next to her for the entire class, and we were all just sitting there like, what the heck is going on? I mean, you've got to understand how bizarre that was for a bunch of middle schoolers. You expect maybe a kid with a severe physical disability to need an aid or something, but Diana was totally fine. She was actually answering questions, raising her hand, chatting with the kids sitting nearby. She didn't look sick at all. But her mom just sat there, acting like it was completely normal to monitor a 7th grader all day. And it wasn't just a one-time thing for the first day either. When recess hit, her mom would go outside and whisper with the homeroom teacher and the monitors. None of us knew what they were talking about. Then, over the next few weeks, things just stayed weird. Every time we got a little loud in class or started goofing around, the teachers would immediately step in and tell us to calm down, specifically warning us not to joke around with Diana too much. They would constantly remind us to speak to her normally, telling us not to make her laugh too hard, and definitely not to tease her because she might cry. It felt incredibly suffocating. On top of that, maybe once a week, her mom would just randomly show up and sit through all our classes again, almost like Diana was refusing to go to school unless her mom was there holding her hand. The strangest rule of all was during our breaks. Diana was absolutely forbidden from leaving the classroom. Not for a walk, not to go to the canteen, nothing. If she wanted a snack or a drink, the teacher would actually come up to me, and even to Nina, handing us the cash and telling us to go run errands and buy whatever Diana wanted. The teacher would pay out of her own pocket and then collect it from Diana's mom later. I remember finding it super odd, but I wasn't really the nosy type. I just bought the snacks and kept my head down. But for Nina, being treated like a personal servant for the new girl just made her despise Diana even more. Nina was what you'd call a problem child. I'm not talking about her grades, though those were garbage too. I mean, she was a menace when it came to behavior. She was the ringleader of the disruptive kids, always talking back, always eating in class, always looking for a weakness to exploit. And she immediately zeroed in on Diana. She and her little group of friends started whispering, wondering out loud why this big girl was getting babied by the entire faculty. And because they were bored, they started poking the bear. I still remember the exact day it all blew up. I have no idea what nasty comment Nina actually muttered under her breath, but whatever it was, it completely shattered Diana. I heard this sudden, guttural scream. I looked back, and Diana was standing up, violently flipping her desk over. Chairs went flying. But the terrifying part was that she didn't go after Nina. Diana was a massive girl, easily the biggest kid in our class, taller and broader than most of the boys. We found out later she was actually 3 years older than us because she'd been held back multiple times. She could have easily crushed Nina. Instead, she turned all that explosive anger inward. She started beating her own chest and arms like a cornered animal, screaming at the top of her lungs, and dragging her fingernails down her own face until she was leaving deep red scratch marks all over her cheeks. It was just sheer, raw panic. We were all completely frozen. If someone attacks you, you can run or fight back, but watching someone violently destroy themselves right in front of you just paralyzes your brain. The teachers came running in, immediately trying to hold her arms down and soothe her, rubbing her back and talking in these soft, panicked voices. They had to call her mom right away. Her mom showed up maybe 10 minutes later, completely out of breath, and just quietly took her home. They made Nina and her friends kneel in front of the chalkboard for multiple class periods as punishment, but they never really explained anything to us that day. It wasn't until about a month later that our homeroom teacher finally addressed the elephant in the room. She stood at the front of the class, looking really tired, and told us that she couldn't hide it anymore. She explained that Diana had a very specific, severe medical condition. The teacher was extremely firm about it, warning us never to call Diana crazy or insane, because she wasn't. She just had this overwhelming nervous system response where she couldn't process intense emotions. If she got too happy, too sad, or too startled, she would completely lose control of her body and enter a state of severe agitation. The teacher pleaded with us to just protect her, explaining that she was a sweet girl who only ever hurt herself when she got overwhelmed. Most of us felt awful and backed off completely, but middle schoolers have zero impulse control. Nina and her friends toned it down, sure, but every now and then, they would still whisper a subtle jab as they walked past Diana's desk, just to see if they could get a reaction. And then the accident happened. I call it an accident, but honestly, it feels like a nightmare I can't wake up from. It was just another random Tuesday. Someone must have teased Diana again, because she snapped. She stood up. shoved her chair backwards so hard it slammed into the wall, and bolted out the classroom door, sprinting straight toward the girls' bathroom at the end of the hall. Now, you have to picture this school. It was old, underfunded, and falling apart. The bathroom stalls were just these cheap corrugated tin sheets screwed into rusted iron frames. For over a month, the door to one of the main stalls had been broken. The metal sheet had warped and peeled away from the frame, sticking out into the walkway like a jagged, rusted razor blade. It was right at head height for most of us, so we were all just used to ducking under it when we went in. Nobody fixed it because the school never had the budget for maintenance. We just lived with it. But when Diana ran out of the classroom, she wasn't thinking. She was in a full-blown sensory meltdown, eyes probably squeezed shut, just trying to find a dark place to hide. Here's the sick irony of it. For us shorter kids, that jagged piece of metal hung right around our forehead level, so we were all just naturally used to ducking our heads under it every single time we went in. But Diana was massive. She was 3 years older and so much taller than the rest of us, which meant that the broken, rusted edge of that tin sheet didn't line up with her forehead. It lined up perfectly with her throat. And because she was in such a blind panic, she didn't even think to duck. She just ran full speed right into that broken stall. None of us saw the actual impact. We just knew she'd run away. A few minutes passed, and then the campus security guard and the principal were suddenly sprinting past our window looking absolutely terrified. Apparently, that jagged piece of tin had caught her right across the neck. It was a massive, deep gash that basically ripped her throat wide open. And the absolute worst part, the part that still makes me feel sick to my stomach, is that if a normal person got cut like that, they'd run out screaming for help, holding their neck. But Diana was already trapped in her own psychological breakdown. Instead of seeking help, she locked herself inside that stall. She just sat there on the floor, clamping her hands over her own neck, refusing to come out while she bled. She sat there in silence for minutes. By the time the security guard managed to break the door down and drag her out, it was too late. I'll never forget the sight of her being carried past the hallway. Her white school uniform was just entirely soaked in dark red. It didn't even look like a shirt anymore. It was just a horrifying, dripping mess. She was barely breathing when they took her, and we found out later that day that she didn't make it. The next day was pure chaos. Her mother came to the school screaming, crying, blaming the teachers, blaming the kids, threatening everyone. But the police and the school board eventually ruled it a tragic accident. The rumors going around said the hospital had actually advised her parents to pull her out of school years ago, suggesting she just stay home once she learned basic reading and math, because a normal school environment was way too dangerous for her condition. But for whatever reason, they kept sending her. The school washed their hands of it. The door got replaced, and we were all just expected to move on. And for a long time, we did. The first semester ended. The weather got hotter. Nothing supernatural happened. No spooky noises. Nothing. We just went back to our miserable middle school routines. That brings us to the second semester, and the direct consequence of being a terrible student. Our school had this disciplinary system where if you ended up in the penalty book for the week, you had to do early morning cleaning duty. They would pair up the kid with the worst academic grades and the kid with the worst behavioral marks. I wasn't a bad kid. I was just unbelievably stupid when it came to math and science. So I was constantly on cleaning duty. But somehow, up until that week, I had never been paired with Nina. I guess my luck ran out. I got flagged for failing my exams, and Nina got flagged for being a general nightmare. So we were officially partners. Cleaning duty meant showing up at school around 6:15 a.m. to sweep the classroom, clean the blackboards, and wipe down the desks before the main bell rang at 7:15 a.m. The school wasn't entirely abandoned at that hour, but it was dead quiet. Most kids who arrived early hung out at the milk tea stalls across the street, because once you walked through the school gates, the guards locked you in. The only people on campus were a few nerds, studying on stone benches on the far side of the courtyard. Our classroom was tucked away in this really isolated corner of the building, right next to the bathrooms. Outside the bathrooms, there was this long open-air concrete sink. It was basically a trough, maybe 15 feet long, with 5 or 6 metal faucets spaced out along the wall. It was meant for washing hands and rinsing out the chalk rags. Our classroom was maybe 30 feet away from it. Nina and I started cleaning in silence because we honestly hated each other. When your chalk rag gets too dirty, you have to walk out to the concrete sink, rinse it out, wring it, and come back. We went out together the first time, but after that, whoever needed water just went by themselves. About 20 minutes in, Nina walked out to rinse her rag. She came back a minute later, looking genuinely annoyed, and told me that some idiot was sitting in the girls' bathroom crying her eyes out. Nina was complaining, saying how pathetic it was that some 7th grader was already crying for their mommy before the sun was even fully up. I'm a bit of a nosy person, so when it was my turn to wash my rag, I stood at the concrete sink and leaned over, straining my ears to listen. The bathroom was completely silent. There were no footsteps, no sniffles, nothing. I walked back into the classroom and told Nina she was hearing things, that the place was empty. Nina rolled her eyes so hard I thought they'd get stuck. When her rag got dirty again, she marched out there, determined to prove me wrong. She came storming back, throwing her rag on the desk, and told me I was completely deaf. She swore she heard the sobbing clearly, and she even claimed she stood outside the open bathroom door and saw a pair of legs sticking out from one of the stalls. Our stalls were tiny, so if you sat on the toilet, your knees almost touched the door, and you could see the bottom of people's uniform skirts from the hallway. She didn't see a face, just the legs, and she was adamant someone was having a breakdown in there. I figured Nina was just trying to mess with me because we were alone in a quiet wing of the school. It was exactly the kind of stupid prank she'd pull to scare the quiet kid. So I just ignored her and kept scrubbing my half of the blackboard. Then it was her turn to wash the rag for the 3rd time. She walked out, and she didn't come back. I finished my entire half of the board. I wiped down 3 rows of desks. It had been at least 4 or 5 minutes. Walking out to the sink, turning on the faucet, wringing a piece of cloth, and walking back takes 30 seconds max. I started getting annoyed, thinking she was just loitering out there to force me to clean her half of the classroom. I threw my rag down, muttering to myself that I was absolutely not doing her work, and I marched out the classroom door to yell at her. The moment I stepped out into the open hallway, I stopped dead in my tracks. Nina wasn't standing at the sink. She was lying inside it. I'm not exaggerating. She was lying flat on her back inside the concrete water trough, perfectly rigid, with both of her arms crossed flat over her stomach like an Egyptian mummy. The trough was deep enough to fit a small kid, but because Nina was tall, her legs were bent in this awkward, unnatural angle just to fit her body inside the concrete basin. And the water, every single one of the 5 faucets was cranked open to maximum pressure. The water was blasting down on her face and chest with this heavy, rushing sound that echoed all over the empty courtyard. It looked exactly like a piece of meat being aggressively washed in a slaughterhouse sink. My brain completely short-circuited. I ran over to the trough, frantically twisting the rusted metal knobs to shut the water off, yelling at her. I asked her what the hell she was doing, if she had completely lost her mind, trying to take a bath in the school sink. I grabbed her shoulder and shook her. Her eyes fluttered open. She looked up at me, and water was just pouring off her eyelashes. And then she started crying. It wasn't a normal cry. It was this silent, terrified weeping. I had only ever known Nina as this aggressive, mean girl who terrorized everyone, but right then, her face was completely crumpled in absolute fear. She tried to open her mouth, but her jaw was locked tight. I grabbed her arm to pull her up, but she was completely stiff. Her muscles were locked solid like a board. She couldn't move a single inch. Panic finally set in. I realized she was actually having some kind of medical emergency or seizure. I told her to just stay still, which was a stupid thing to say since she literally couldn't move, and I turned around to sprint toward the main office to find a security guard. I took exactly 2 steps away from the sink. Behind me, I heard the heavy, metallic squeaking of the faucet knobs turning, screeching against the rusted threads as if some invisible hand was violently cranking them open, and I whipped around to see all 5 faucets blasting water again. Nobody had touched them. Nina was still paralyzed, like a corpse, and the water was rapidly filling up the basin, washing over her nose and mouth. She was going to drown right there in the concrete trough. I ran back, swearing under my breath, frantically twisting the knobs off again, my hands slipping on the wet metal. I got the last one shut off, and as I was leaning over Nina, wiping the water off her face so she could breathe, my eyes naturally drifted up toward the open doorway of the girls' bathroom, just a few yards away. Diana was standing there. She was positioned half in the shadow of the bathroom, half in the dim morning light of the hallway. She was wearing the exact same white uniform shirt, but it wasn't clean. It was dark, stiff, and heavy-looking. I couldn't look away from her face. It was completely distorted with this violent, bubbling rage. Her lips were pulled back, her teeth grinding together so hard I felt like I could hear the enamel cracking. Her hands were balled into tight fists at her sides, shaking with aggressive energy. But the most horrifying detail was that she wasn't looking at me. Her eyes were locked entirely on Nina lying in the sink. The sheer hatred radiating off her posture made the air feel freezing cold. I just lost my fucking mind, let out this pathetic, choking scream, and bolted. I abandoned Nina in the sink and ran screaming down the hallway until I practically slammed into the discipline teacher who was doing his morning rounds. I was hyperventilating, just pointing back down the corridor, unable to form a coherent sentence. The teacher ran past me. By the time I caught up to him, maybe 10 seconds later, the faucets were blasting water for a 3rd time. The teacher didn't hesitate. He reached in, shut off the water, and hoisted Nina out of the trough. She was completely limp now. Her face was pale, and as he laid her on the dry concrete, water started bubbling out of her nose and mouth. She had actually inhaled the water. She was literally drowning in a hand-washing sink. He had to perform aggressive CPR, but because her lungs were completely swamped, he literally hauled her up over his shoulder and started jumping up and down like a madman to force the water out, before throwing her back down to pound on her chest and blow air into her mouth. It took a solid minute before she suddenly convulsed and threw up a massive puddle of water, gasping for air. The second her eyes opened, the terror took over completely. She didn't thank the teacher. She didn't look at me. She scrambled backward against the wall, pointing a trembling finger toward the empty bathroom door, and started screaming Diana's name over and over again. Her voice was shredded and hoarse, and then she raised both of her hands and started violently dragging her fingernails down her own face. You know how 7th grade girls are starting to get super vain, right? Nina always kept her fingernails long and filed to look pretty. So when she dug those long, sharp nails directly into her own flesh, she scratched herself so hard that thick ribbons of blood instantly welled up on her cheeks. She was crying and begging to go home, tearing at her own skin exactly the same way Diana had done on that very first day she had a meltdown. It was like watching a horrific, twisted reenactment. They had to restrain her and call her parents to drag her out of school. She was suspended for medical reasons, and she didn't come back the next day, or the next week. She was gone for nearly 2 weeks. The next time we saw her, she actually came back to the school to officially withdraw her transcripts, and it was incredibly jarring because she showed up wearing these gray Buddhist temple robes with her head completely shaved bald, and her face just looked utterly hollow and miserable. During that time, the rumors in our neighborhood went completely out of control. Kids who lived near Nina started talking. They said Nina wasn't just traumatized, they said Diana was attached to her. From what the neighbors whispered, Diana didn't possess Nina to speak or make demands. She just used Nina's body to relive her own suffering. Nina's entire personality vanished. The loud, obnoxious bully was replaced by this terrified, mute girl who would randomly suffer extreme bouts of overstimulation. Whenever it happened, she would rip her clothes, bang her head against the plaster walls, and claw at her own face until her hands were restrained. She never tried to hurt her parents, or anyone else. She only destroyed herself. Her family was desperate. They hired a local monk to come to the house and perform a cleansing ritual. They figured out pretty quickly that Diana's spirit was specifically targeting Nina because she was the ringleader of the bullying that eventually pushed Diana into that bathroom. The ritual was an absolute disaster. Up until that point, the possessions had followed a strict schedule. Diana would only take over in the late evening, maybe from 5:30 p.m. until around 8 or 9 at night, but she never, ever showed up in the middle of the day. The monk set up an altar in their living room right in the middle of the afternoon, assuming the entity would be completely dormant, but Diana completely shattered her own rules to prove a point. Right as he started chanting, Nina's eyes rolled back. She didn't attack the monk. Instead, she threw herself at the altar, flipping the heavy wooden table completely over. Then, in front of everyone, she crawled on the floor, scooped up handfuls of burning incense ashes from the shattered censer, and shoved them directly into her mouth. She chewed on the glowing embers, blistering the inside of her own throat, just completely destroying her own vocal cords to stop the chanting. It escalated. A few days later, Nina managed to run out of her house and sprinted straight to Diana's family home a few streets over. She smashed Diana's memorial altar to pieces. When they dragged her away, she ran to the local cemetery and started violently bashing her forehead against Diana's concrete headstone. The message was incredibly clear. Diana didn't want apologies. She didn't want rituals. And she absolutely refused to forgive the people who drove her to her death. Eventually, a senior nun from a prominent temple intervened. She told Nina's parents that traditional exorcisms were just going to get their daughter killed because the spirit was operating purely on grief and rage, not demonic logic. The only option left was complete surrender. They pulled Nina out of school entirely. They shaved her head bare, put her in traditional gray temple robes, and sent her to live in the monastery as a novice. Even inside the temple grounds, the possession didn't stop immediately. She would still occasionally lose control, tearing her robes, throwing herself against the heavy bronze temple bells, and she would even sprint right up to the sacred Buddha altar to violently trash the offerings, right in front of the monks. But the holy environment slowly chipped away at the intensity. The nun forced Nina to sit in front of a specialized memorial tablet they made for Diana. Every single day, for an entire year, Nina had to sit on the cold floor for an hour, striking a wooden block and chanting repentant sutras and the Great Compassion mantra dedicated entirely to Diana's soul. It was a life of total submission, paying off a debt for a life she helped ruin. After a whole year of staying in that temple, Nina finally came back to school to repeat the 7th grade while I was already moving up to the 9th. Honestly, looking at her, she was a completely different person. The wild, mean girl was just gone, replaced by this quiet, top-tier student who measured every single word she said. She spent an entire year chanting for Diana, trying to make things right. I really, really hope Diana's spirit finally found some peace after all that. I don't even know what else to say about it. It's just exhausting to think about. This whole messed up thing happened about 12 or 13 years ago, back when I was 16. I'm 28 now, but honestly it still feels like yesterday. At the time, my parents, my nearly 4-year-old brother, who, by the way, started talking at barely a year old and never shut up, giving us all massive headaches, and I were crammed into this tiny, sweltering tin-roofed rental at the end of a really muddy dirt road. After barely surviving a week of sweating on top of each other, my folks decided to rent the empty room right next door for like 700,000 dong, which is maybe $30, just so I could have some privacy as a teenage girl and we'd finally have a place to park our motorbikes and dump the washing machine. I need to paint a picture of just how miserable this place was before things got weird. The dirt road leading to our row of units was basically a swamp. Every time it rained even a little bit, you had to roll your pants up to your knees just to get to the main street, and the mud would just cake onto your shoes with this awful smell of stagnant water and rotting leaves. Inside wasn't much better. The tin roof acted like an oven during the day, baking the concrete walls so that by the time you tried to go to sleep, the whole room was radiating this oppressive, heavy heat that made it hard to breathe. We just had this one cheap oscillating fan that rattled back and forth, blowing hot air into our faces. It was miserable. So renting that second room was a lifesaver. We split our stuff up. My parents and my little brother took the main room, and I moved into the new one next door. It felt great finally having my own space, not having to worry about changing clothes in the bathroom or listening to my dad snore. Plus, we moved the 3 motorbikes and the washing machine over to my side, so my parents had more floor space. Everything was perfectly normal for the first few days. It was just a crappy, hot rental in a noisy neighborhood. Then my dad actually got really lucky. He was out drinking coffee and bought one of those bottled green teas that were running a summer promotion, and he actually won the grand prize. It was a brand new air conditioning unit, worth a couple $100, which was a huge deal for us back then. He only had to pay maybe $40 or so out of pocket to hire a guy to come install the copper piping and set it up. But here was the problem. We had 2 rooms now, and only 1 AC unit. Everybody wanted to sleep in the cold air. The installation guy, trying to be helpful, suggested a pretty janky but brilliant workaround. Since our 2 rooms shared a thin brick partition wall, he said he could just smash a square hole right in the middle of the wall near the ceiling, about half a square meter wide, and mount the AC unit directly inside the hole. That way the cold air would blow into both rooms at the same time. My parents agreed immediately. I still remember sitting on my mattress, covering my ears while the guy took a sledgehammer to the wall, sending concrete dust all over my cheap blankets. Once it was installed, it was amazing. For the first 3 or 4 nights, I slept like a baby. The cold air pouring through that hole was the most comfortable I had been in months. But then, the weird little things started happening. My little brother, who usually slept like a log without ever waking up to cry or use the bathroom, started getting really restless. I was eating dinner with my mom one evening, and she kept yawning, complaining that she hadn't slept at all because the kid was rolling around kicking the blankets off all night. She said he was tossing and turning, sometimes whimpering, sometimes giggling in his sleep, and at one point he even sat bolt upright in the dark and just laughed before falling back down. When we asked him about it, his explanation was super weird but also kind of typical for a kid with an overactive imagination. He mumbled something about dreaming that his room was crowded. He said there were a bunch of extra people in there, and someone kept playing tag with him, chasing him up and down the loft area. I didn't think anything of it. I figured he was just playing with the neighborhood kids all day in the dirt and his brain was just processing it at night. But this kept happening for like a solid week. Because my room was bigger and had all the cool stuff in it, my brother loved hanging out on my side during the day. One afternoon, he was just sitting on the floor playing with some plastic toys when he suddenly stopped, tapped my leg, and started rambling about his dreams again. He told me that in his dream, the room was full of people again, but there was this one specific guy. He said the guy really liked me. According to my 4-year-old brother, this imaginary guy kept asking him what my name was, how old I was, what school I went to, and what grade I was in. I got pretty annoyed. I told him to stop making up stupid stories, telling him there was no way a 4-year-old dreams about random guys asking for a teenage girl's age and school. I thought he was just repeating some crap he heard on a soap opera my mom was watching. He got really defensive and swore he was telling the truth, but I just brushed it off. A couple of days later, he came back with an update. He tugged on my shirt and told me the guy from his dream was getting impatient. He said the guy kept asking him what he should do because he liked me so much, and kept aggressively asking if I already had a boyfriend. It was oddly specific, and definitely gave me a weird, uncomfortable feeling in my gut. But again, I just blamed his weird little kid brain. Then things escalated. Maybe 2 nights later. I don't know exactly what time it was. Maybe around 2:15 a.m. or something. I woke up to the sound of my brother screaming. Because of that giant square hole in the wall for the AC, the 2 rooms basically had 0 soundproofing. I could hear everything. I rushed over to their room to see what was going on. He wasn't fully awake. He was in this weird delirious state, thrashing around, crying really loud one second, and then whimpering and panting heavily the next. My mom grabbed the old mercury thermometer and shoved it under his arm, and it read over 39 degrees Celsius, which is a really high fever. My parents were freaking out. They didn't think about anything supernatural. They just thought he was severely sick. They decided to rush him to the local 24-hour clinic right then and there. They threw on some jackets, grabbed him, and told me to just stay in my room, lock the door, and watch TV until they got back. When they left, my mom actually locked the exterior padlock on their door, and since our rooms were totally separate from the outside, I was alone in my room. I figured they would be gone for at least an hour or two. I went back to my mattress, pulled the blanket up, and tried to doze off because I had school the next morning. I was just hovering in that weird space between being awake and falling asleep when I heard noises coming from my parents' room next door. It wasn't loud, but it was impossible to ignore because of the AC hole. I heard distinct footsteps pacing back and forth across their tiled floor. Then I heard the unmistakable squeak of their bathroom door opening, the sound of the faucet running, and this low, muffled whispering. I was so confused. I thought there was no way they were back from the clinic after only 10 minutes. I got up, opened my door, and looked outside. The padlock was still securing their door from the outside. The room was physically locked and empty. I convinced myself I was just hearing things, maybe the pipes acting up, or the neighbors a few doors down being loud. I went back to bed, but over the next 45 minutes, it just kept happening. The pacing, the squeaking door, the low muttering, and this heavy, ragged breathing sound that seemed to float right near the ceiling by the AC unit. Every time I got up to check, the padlock was still there. After the third time, I just pulled the blanket over my head and forced myself to sleep, blaming it on my own paranoia. When I woke up the next morning, my parents were back. I asked what the doctor said, and my mom looked super annoyed. She told me the doctor said there was absolutely nothing wrong with him. By the time they got to the clinic, his temperature had dropped to a completely normal 37.5 degrees. The doctor basically implied he was faking it, or just had a mild night sweat. That afternoon when I came home from school, things got even weirder. I walked in and saw my mom setting out 2 separate trays of food. Now my family never did the whole elaborate ancestor worship food offering thing on random weekdays because all our grandparents were still alive. We only had a small altar for general prayers, but there was a large tray for us to eat, and a smaller tray set aside on a separate table. I asked her what the heck that was for, and she snapped at me, telling me to mind my own business, muttering that someone told her to offer some food so my brother could sleep in peace. I looked at the offering tray. I remember exactly what was on it because it was such a weird combination. There was a bowl of fermented tofu paste, a small plate of garlic stir-fried morning glory, and a few pieces of braised pork. It wasn't our normal meal. I just stared at it, feeling this creeping sense of wrongness, but I didn't say anything. That night is when the real nightmare started. I had the remote for the AC, and because I was a teenager who loved the cold, I always set it to like 18 or 19 degrees and bundled up in a thick blanket. My parents hated it. They preferred it around 25 degrees. So usually, my dad would pull up a plastic chair in his room, stand on it, and reach his hand through the gap between the AC unit and the concrete wall to manually push the directional air vents upwards so it wouldn't blow directly on their bed. He had already done this around 9:30 p.m. I was lying in bed around midnight, trying to sleep, when I kept hearing this plastic scraping noise. It was this slow, deliberate sound, like someone dragging their fingers against the plastic louvers of the AC vent, coming from the other side of the wall. I figured my dad was cold again, because my brother had just been sick. I stayed under my blanket and called out, asking him if it was too cold, and if he wanted me to turn the temperature up. Nobody answered. I just grabbed the remote and bumped it up to 23 degrees. It was quiet for about 15 minutes, and then the scraping started again. I sighed, thinking he was still freezing, so I clicked it all the way up to 26 degrees. Now it was actually getting warm in my room. I kicked my blanket off, annoyed, but willing to deal with it for my sick brother. Another 20 minutes passed, and the rattling started again. It was louder this time, more aggressive. I rolled onto my back and stared up at the hole in the wall. The room was pitch black, but the little LED display on the AC gave off enough light for me to see the silhouette of a hand. A pale hand reaching from my parents' room, gripping the plastic vent, pushing it down, then pulling it up. I called out again, asking my dad if 26 degrees was seriously still too cold for him. Total silence. I kept my eyes locked on that gap in the wall. And then, the hand stopped moving. The fingers curled around the plastic edge, and slowly, this face pressed itself into the narrow space between the machine and the jagged concrete. It was only half a face, just an eye, a cheekbone, and part of a mouth, illuminated by the green glow of the LED display. It was staring dead at me. And the absolute worst part was the realization that hit me like a physical punch to the stomach. That wasn't my dad. The skin was smooth. The eye was wide and manic. It was the face of a young guy, maybe in his early 20s. I absolutely lost my mind. I thought some creep had broken into my parents' room. I vaulted out of bed, screaming at the top of my lungs, and slammed my fists against the partition wall. The face and the hand instantly shot back into the darkness. I ran outside and pounded on my parents' door until they unlocked it. I was hyperventilating, screaming that there was a burglar in their room, hiding near the ceiling. My dad flipped all the lights on. They checked under the bed, in the bathroom, everywhere. The windows were locked from the inside. The door had been bolted. There was no one there. My mom was furious. My brother had started crying from the noise, and she just laid into me, yelling that I was reading too many stupid comic books and making up absolute bullshit to ruin their sleep. I was practically in tears, swearing I saw a guy. I turned to my dad and asked if he had just been standing on the chair adjusting the vent. He looked at me like I was insane and said he adjusted it once at 9 p.m. and had been dead asleep ever since. He told me to go back to bed and stop acting crazy. I went back to my room, feeling sick to my stomach, questioning my own sanity. I eventually cried myself to sleep, and that's when the first dream happened. It felt incredibly real. I was sitting on the floor of a rental room, not a random room, but the exact room my parents were renting next door. The same peeling paint, the same tiled floor, the same old TV in the corner, but my real family wasn't there. Instead, there were 4 strangers sitting around a meal spread out on a woven mat, an older man and woman acting as my parents, a little girl acting as my younger sister, and a young man sitting right next to me. There were 5 of us total, crammed around this tiny tray of food. And the food, it was exactly what my mom had put on the offering tray that afternoon. The fermented tofu, the garlic morning glory, the braised pork. Everyone was smiling at me with this sickeningly intense affection. The older woman kept pushing bowls toward me, telling me to eat. The little girl tugged my sleeve, calling me her big sister. And the guy sitting next to me, the one acting like my husband, kept putting choice pieces of meat into my bowl, speaking to me with this gentle, loving tone. I looked at his face, and my blood ran cold, even in the dream. It was the same guy, the face from the AC vent. But in the dream, I didn't feel scared. I felt this weird, artificial sense of comfort. We ate, and I remember the food tasting absolutely incredible. After the meal, I stood up and started washing the dishes in the corner, acting exactly like a dutiful, subservient housewife. The guy, he told me his name was Gale, came up behind me, gently massaging my shoulders, asking if I was tired. When I woke up the next morning, I actually laughed about it. I told my friends at school that I must be desperate for a boyfriend because I was already dreaming about being a married housewife at 16. I thought it was just a funny, weird nightmare. I had no idea I was getting dragged into a spiritual attachment, what the older folks call a ghost marriage. That first dream completely rewired my brain. The food in the dream tasted so overwhelmingly good that when I came home and tried to eat my mom's cooking, it tasted like ash. I couldn't swallow it. I started picking at my food, eating almost nothing, and my personality changed overnight. I became incredibly aggressive toward my real family. Before this, I loved my little brother, but suddenly, I couldn't stand the sight of him. When he tried to play with me, I would kick his toys away and tell him to get the hell out of my room. Every single night, I would dive back into that same dream. The dynamic was always the same. This fake family showered me with unconditional love, which was a massive contrast to my real parents who were stressed out, overworked, and constantly yelling at me. I started craving the dream. I wanted to be asleep. I wanted to see Gail. I wanted the little ghost girl to hand me these weird, hard, peanut brittle candies, the kind you only ever see on graveyard offering altars, because in the dream, they tasted like heaven. Gail would always hand me stacks of cash, telling me to keep it safe for our family. It was this perfect, twisted domestic fantasy that preyed exactly on a teenage girl's desire to be loved and taken care of. I was stuck in this cycle for 10 days. Physically, I was deteriorating. I was barely eating, losing so much weight that my school pants were literally falling off my hips. My skin turned this sickly, pale gray color. My mom kept asking if I was sick or if my period was messed up. Even my teachers told me to go to the nurse's office because I looked like a walking corpse. But I didn't care. I just wanted to sleep. By the 6th or 7th day, the entity didn't even wait for nighttime anymore. It started pulling me under during the day. I would be sitting in class, put my head on the desk for a second, and instantly, I was back in the rental room with Gail. He would whisper in my ear, telling me I didn't need to study, that I should just drop out and come home to be his wife, because he had plenty of money for us. I'd fall asleep on a hammock at a bubble tea shop, and the ghost mother would appear, scolding me for not being home to cook dinner. One time my parents dragged me to this night market and let my little brother play in one of those plastic ball pits, and I just slumped over the handlebars of my dad's parked motorbike and passed out. And immediately I was dreaming about that little ghost girl whining at me, throwing a tantrum, and asking why I took that other kid out to play instead of her, because she was supposed to be my real sister-in-law. I was living 2 entirely separate lives, and the real one was fading fast. Then came the 9th dream, the one where things escalated from psychological manipulation to physical violation. I was asleep in my room, but in the dream, Gail didn't wait for me at the dinner tray. He walked right up to my bed, grabbed my hand, and pulled me up. I felt weightless. As he led me toward the door, I looked back and saw my own physical body still lying on the mattress, fast asleep. I swear to you I was literally floating outside my own skin, just looking down at my own physical body left behind on the bed. But my brain was so completely screwed up by whatever had a hold on me that I didn't even think to panic. He led me right through the solid wall into my parents' room. We walked right past my dad snoring and my mom holding my brother. We passed right through the locked front door and out into the muddy, pitch-black area behind the rental units. He sat me down in the dark dirt, and then he sat right behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. He started kissing my neck, his hands slipping under my shirt, aggressively grabbing and feeling my chest. I just sat there, compliant, thinking this was totally normal because he was my husband, and this was just what married couples did. There was no lower body contact, no actual intercourse, just this endless, repetitive groping that felt like it went on for hours in the cold dark. When I woke up the next morning, the dreamy haze vanished and sheer terror took over. I went to the bathroom to splash water on my face, and when I looked in the mirror, my breath caught in my throat. There was a massive dark purple hickey on the side of my neck. I pulled my shirt down with shaking hands, and there, right across my chest, was a vivid, angry red handprint. The skin felt bruised and sore. I even felt lingering pain lower down, like I'd been roughly handled. I scrubbed my skin with soap until it was raw, crying quietly so my mom wouldn't hear. I was utterly terrified. Until now, it was just dreams. Now, there was physical evidence on my body, but who the hell was I supposed to tell? I was a 16-year-old girl. If I told my mom I had a hickey and handprints all over me, she would have beaten me half to death thinking I sneaked a boy into my room. I was too ashamed to tell anyone, so I kept my mouth shut. That night was the 10th and final encounter. The sequence started exactly the same. The out-of-body pull, the walk through the wall, the dark patch of dirt, behind the house. He sat behind me again, his cold hands instantly going under my clothes, his mouth on my neck. I was in that same mindless, compliant daze, leaning back into him, letting it happen. At some point, while I was getting entirely swept up in the physical sensation, I reached my hand forward in the dark to grab his leg, but my fingers didn't touch skin or fabric. I felt cold, jagged stone. There were these weird, hard lumps carved into it. The shock snapped me out of the trance. I forced my eyes open, squinting through the oppressive darkness. I wasn't sitting in an empty patch of dirt. I was sitting directly in front of 3 concrete headstones. I stared at the faded ceramic photos cemented into the graves. Even in the gloom, I recognized the faces instantly. It was the older man, the older woman, and the little girl from my dreams. I swear to God, all that warm, fuzzy, compliant feeling just instantly vanished, and my blood turned to ice water because I whipped my head around to look at Gail, but there was absolutely nobody there behind me, and my stomach just violently dropped when I realized I wasn't leaning against a warm chest, but my bare back was pressed aggressively hard against this freezing concrete block. So I scrambled away on my hands and knees, slipping in the mud, and I looked back at the thing I was just grinding against, and it was a fucking 4th headstone, staring right back at me, with Gail's ceramic photo cemented right in the middle of it. I was just paralyzed there, hyperventilating in the dark, until I saw this blinding beam of light cutting through the trees, and heard some old guy yelling, asking what the hell a little girl was doing out here at 3 a.m. It was just some local grandpa out catching frogs with a headlamp on his head, and I was just crying trying to tell him I lived in the rentals, and he just pointed his light at the graves and casually told me those belonged to the landlord's dead relatives. He ended up walking me the 100 meters or so back to my unit, and that's when I looked down and realized I was completely soaked to the bone and covered in thick, foul-smelling swamp mud because I had literally sleepwalked straight through a flooded morning glory pond to get out there. I just threw myself at my parents' door, pounding on it like a maniac, and when my mom opened it, I just collapsed, hugging her and bawling my eyes out, confessing everything that had been going on for the last 10 days, while they just stood there, looking absolutely horrified. We packed our bags the second the sun came up, but not before the neighbors told us the landlady was so cheap, she actually buried her own dead brother's family, right in her own backyard, just to save money to build more rental rooms for her kids' college tuition, instead of paying for a proper cemetery. And they also spilled the real story about how they died in a gas leak, and the detail that still makes my skin crawl. The teenage boy, my supposed ghost husband, had suffered a massive trauma to his groin in an accident before he died, completely losing his ability to function down there. The spiritual guy we consulted literally told us we just needed to light some incense and ask for peace, skipping the heavy exorcism stuff because the ghost was, well, physically incapable of fully claiming me. So yeah, I packed my bags and left, carrying the absolutely sickening realization that the only thing standing between me and actually having sex with a ghost was his missing junk.